Hello, G Rose, and today we're going to be talking about The Map is Indestructible, Part 1 on Korzybski's Insanity, Goethel's Inconsistency, Barfield's Rainbow, Leibniz's Monad, Zizek's Hegelian Ideology, and Pynchon's Mad Love. This is Part 1, and it is the title piece for the second volume of the True Isn't the Rational trilogy. This paper is going to start talking about how we can think a man named Alfred Korzybski's work with Kurt Gödel. And Science and Sanity is the particular book that Korzybski wrote that I think is quite tremendous, and that certainly can be read with the Science of Logic by Hegel. Alfred Korzybski describes himself as a non-Aristotelian thinker, and he actually thinks that the logic and symbolic or semantics of Aristotle, which orbit in A is A, what he calls identification logic, actually contribute to mental breakdown, to insanity, etc., so forth. Korzybski notes that there is no identity in nature, that things are not simply themselves. When you refer to a tree, it's just like Hegel tells us in the remarks of the Science of Logic. To describe what a tree is, I have to start talking about the limbs, the leaves, the branches, the what makes it up, the bark. So tree automatically passes over into otherness the moment I start talking about it. And Korzybski's point is that's exactly right, Hegel. I don't think Korzybski was familiar with the Science of Logic by Hegel. Maybe he was, but the point is that to think is to think of a thing as something else. We never simply think of a thing. The moment I talk about a cup, sure, because of my abstracting capacities, I can hold the idea of cup as a kind of placeholder by which to refer to the phenomenon in the kitchen. But the moment you ask me what is a cup, I have to start describing other things, handle, what makes it up, composition, and so on. So it immediately passes over into otherness. And Korzybski's point is, this being the case, we really need to rethink logic, because most of our logic and ontology and metaphysics and etc. so forth is based on a notion of identification which doesn't exist. We can certainly associate Korzybski with relational ontologies that emphasize relation, maybe a Whitehead, a Bergson, a Barfield, etc. And what Korzybski believes is that if we don't acknowledge that relations are unavoidable, that they are primary in our thinking, then we're going to make ourselves insane, because insanity, to put it quite simply, insanity is a result of thinking something is true that is false, to be lost in a delusion. Well, our entire logical structure focused on identification is setting us up for that madness, quote unquote. Alex Ebert, in his paper featured in Enter the Alien, makes a note of how there's an argument in mathematics today of the need to remove the equal sign in favor of equivalence. And we can see Korzybski making similar points, that he kind of refers to identification as a kind of virus that's infecting our thinking, that's lurking everywhere, and it's very prevalent. And as a result, it throws us off in all sorts of areas. He makes a point where if you think you have to have a clear objective or a clear identification in order to advance a study or to define a field, this in of itself is a mistake, because there are no stable identities or stable objects or even stable goals, you could say. And so if that becomes a prerequisite for, say, policy or scientific investigation, that's going to lead to all sorts of issues, Korzybski notes. He also has this lovely line, to quote Korzybski. Someone may say, granted to everything Korzybski is telling us, but why fuss so much about it? And this is Korzybski speaking. My answer would be, identification is found in all known primitive peoples, in all known forms of mental ills, and in the great majority of personal, national, and international maladjustments. It is important, therefore, to eliminate such a harmful factor from our prevailing systems. Certainly no one would care to contaminate his child with a dangerous germ once it is known that the given factor is dangerous, Furthermore, the results of a complete elimination of identity are so far-reaching and beneficial for the daily life of everyone and for science that such fussing is not only justified, but becomes one of the primary tasks before us. We could also associate Korzybski with what I call the modern counter-enlightenment, which is discussed in the book The Absolute Choice, which I think certainly Korzybski is part of, and was likewise aware of the dangers that would befall us if we did not acknowledge that thought always has to refer to something outside of itself, that identification is never pure identification. It is always incomplete, that it is always fuzzy, if you will. And if this is overlooked, we end up in totalitarianism, pathologies, philosophical melancholia, all of these different things. Another way, and it's very interesting, Korzybski also, it's very fascinating, suggests that if we really study the structure of mathematics, then we will see identification doesn't work. Mathematics is structurally relational. You could even say geometrical, which will later get us into Leibniz. And of course, there is something funny about this because, on the face of it, you would associate mathematics with pure identification, with kind of, is there anything more bare bones and autonomous than math? Well, Korzybski suggests that if we pay attention to the structure of mathematics, then not simply the information, but the structure of mathematics, then we see that we cannot escape relations, that mathematics itself is relational, that it entails a certain passing over between everything. He points out, and this is going to be important because if what Alfred Korzybski is saying about math is the case, if it is fundamentally relational, if there is a certain incompleteness to thinking that is that algebraic autonomous rationality of thought has to pass over beyond itself, then this is how we begin to move from Korzybski into Kurt Gödel in his famous incompleteness theorem. Korzybski also writes that even objects could be considered as relations between the sub-microscopic events in the human nervous system. We don't experience atoms, for example, just atoms through our senses, hence relation. And this, of course, is alluding to Owen Barfield, who I had a wonderful time talking about with Matt Segal and Ashton. I really enjoyed that discussion. And what Korzybski is pointing out here is that an object is all relations. Alex Ebert tells us that relations saturate into relata. And Mr. Ebert's free clear, I think, is extremely important, and I think absolutely aligns with Korzybski here. And, we could say that the incompleteness of a thing is found in how a relata cannot exist without a saturation of relations, that it can't be a complete thing without those relations, without that saturation. It is incomplete in of itself. It is always, quote unquote, passing over into other things. And I do think Alex Ebert's explanation of what Hegel means by attraction and repelling and all of that at the end of the Doctrine of Being and the Science of Logic, toward the end of that section, is spot on, and again I think aligns with Korzybski and Gödel. Korzybski writes again, consider a multi-ordinal term as it applies to all levels of abstraction and so has no general content, which is to say we are always referring to a stack, quote unquote, of dimensions or network of relations that we might say emerge to a meaning that cannot be generalized beyond the specific case of interpretation. So a bookcase is a stack of many different things: wood, atoms, my sight of it, the colors that I'm experiencing according to my access to the color spectrum, and so on and so forth. It's multi-ordinal. It's multi-orders. Interpenetrating is a term. Interrelating, interpenetrating is a way that Dr. Vervaeke will talk about it. And I think Dr. Vervaeke particularly seems to align with Korzybski in Vervaeke's understanding that the failure to make relations primarily to nihilism or a meaning crisis. For Korzybski, the failure to see relations as primary in the semantic structure, as he calls it, as he thinks about it, which then, of course, puts Korzybski in the same class of thinking as C.S. Peirce. But as Vervaeke understands, de-emphasizing relations leads to a meaning crisis, so Korzybski understands de-emphasizing relations leads to quote-unquote insanity. And so what ultimately Korzybski is going to push for is a new symbolic, a new logical schema by which to think. And we can align this with what we've talked about at Philosophy Portal with Gödel on Hegel, and this was in the Logic of the Global Brain, which is an anthology that came out of Philosophy Portal that everyone should pick up. And what we could say is that Korzybski is telling us we need a new symbolic. We need a new framework, or else we're going to go mad. We need to sublate Aristotle. Korzybski himself frames himself as a non-Aristotelian and kind of anti-Aristotelian. But I think we can see in him a sublation. A way he puts it is, imagine we were trying to do modern physics or modern mathematics with Roman numerals. His point would be, it's literally impossible. The symbolic of Roman numerals make it impossible to do modern physics. You need a new symbolic. You need better symbols, better ways of representing reality. And if you tried to do modern physics with Roman numerals, you would go mad. You would go insane. Well, that's basically what he's saying has happened with using Aristotelian logic in an unsublated form. We're using an outdated symbolic and we are going mad. Likewise, to think that identification is an outdated symbolic and we are going mad. That doesn't mean it didn't have a role to help get us to where we are. That would be the Hegelian move through history. But it is to say that if we stay in the symbolic, there will be trouble. And what we need is a symbolic that, I was talking with Clayton about this, is one that accepts that things are fuzzy logic, you could say. And I've heard other people on the liminal web talk this way, that we relate to things in a fuzzy way. We relate to a bookshelf in a fuzzy way. It isn't a solid identification, but it has a certain fuzziness to it because we have to always refer to something else, A-B logic, as we talk about. And so we need a symbolic in a logic and a metaphysics and ontology that makes us more attuned with the fuzziness of reality. Otherwise, we will go insane. We will not have a science of sanity, as Korzybski would put it. Now, a thinker that I think actually helps justify what Korzybski is saying is Kurt Gödel. Now, this might seem odd because in one way, Gödel seems to suggest mathematics is incomplete, and wouldn't that kind of fly in the face of Korzybski's effort to see in the structure of mathematics a justification for a new symbolic. But actually, if Gödel is correct that there is something essentially incomplete about mathematics, then that would suggest that mathematics requires something beyond itself, or it's always relating outside a formal system. And that, I think, actually complements Korzybski's work. If indeed the structure of mathematics is key to a science of sanity, then taking seriously incompleteness, which I would argue means we just can't have an autonomous algebra. We have to move to geometry from Descartes to Leibniz, as we'll get into. Then that actually, I think, complements Korzybski's effort. And furthermore, I think it also suggests that a logical system that sees itself as self-subsistent, self-justifying, like Aristotelian logic, if we're not careful, that becomes an impossible project, or that project is done with. And I like Ernest Nagel and James R. Newman's book on Gödel. I think Rebecca Goldstein also does very good work on it. And a way that they put, they say that with the incompleteness theorem, which is discussing the possibility of the Principia Mathematica by Russell and Whitehead on the possibility of a formal system. And a formal system is a system of which entails its own rules, own inferences. It is completely self-referential. It doesn't require anything outside of itself. And thus, and you see this is very important because if a formal system is not possible even theoretically, then an autonomous, grounded understanding of reality, a complete essential truth, we could say, a final system, would not be possible as self-referential. Now, and Brendan Graham Dempsey has made this point, and he's correct on this. This does not mean that a theory of everything in any shape or form is impossible. You would just have to have theory of everything that entailed its own incompleteness. You couldn't have a theory of everything that was a formal system, meaning it denied incompleteness. A theory of everything that entailed incompleteness, which I think an absolute idealism of Hegel would qualify for this. Some of the Whitehead, Burke's, I could go on. These things would qualify as theories of everything, but it would do so geometrically, and it'd be a theory of a situation, meaning relations. And if you have a theory of everything, and if you almost want to call it a theory of every relation, not a theory of everything per se, then this becomes possible. But a theory of everything is only possible if it entails its own incompleteness. And a way to think of Gödel's, from the book here, Gödel's grand final step is we are forced to conclude that if Principia Mathematica is consistent, its consistency cannot be established by any meta-mathematical reasoning that can be mirrored within Principia Mathematica. What this would mean is that in order to understand the functioning of the system that the Principia puts forth, the idea is that you need, for it to be a formal system, and a way to think about formal system is a system that can form itself. It doesn't need anything external to form itself. Well, to do that, then the rules of the system that describe its unfolding have to be provided by that system. So it provides its own rules of operation. And Gödel wants to say that's not possible. There has to be some reference to something outside of itself. I guess a way to think of it, I'm not saying this is necessarily the way that Gödel puts it, but a way to think about it is if you're trying, a formal system would require an equal sign. You'd have to say that everything in the system ultimately can equal itself. The system equals the system. Well, we've pointed out, following Leibniz, that if x equals y, then x is y. And so y doesn't really even exist. And so x doesn't equal y. And this kind of suggests the problem. Like a formal system would ultimately have to reach a point, at some point would have to entail an equal sign. The formal system equals reality, or it equals itself. Well, if it equals itself, then that's a tautology. Then that's only meaningful. Hegel talks about tautologies as not really simply being a restatement. There's always a difference in the a to the left to the a to the right of the equal sign. And that would be our relation between the two a's. They're not the same to us. There's a relation there that changes the meaning. So likewise, if you say a system equals a system, then something has transpired that makes you believe that's a meaningful statement. And if so, there's something external to the system, ergo a relation to it that's external to the system. Otherwise, it would simply be a restatement and thus nothing at all. So a way to put it is that if you want a formal justification, you need an equal sign, but equal signs are impossible, only equivalence. There's always a slight excess. Well, that slight excess cannot be included in the formal consistency of the system, therefore the formal system is an impossibility. And again, we should also just kind of note, the result of Gödel's analysis should not be misunderstood. It does not exclude a meta-mathematical proof of the consistency of Principia Mathematica. What it excludes is a proof of consistency that can be mirrored inside Principia Mathematica, and that's from Nagel's book. So you can certainly have a meta-mathematical proof of consistency. You can have a theory of everything that entails its own incompleteness, which automatically is meta, because to acknowledge incompleteness would mean there's something external that can tell the incompleteness. It just means you cannot have a consistency that mirrors itself and justifies itself. You cannot have consistency equal correspondence. As I spoke with Chiton about, you could ultimately say that Gödel says we have to choose between consistency or correspondence. Which do you want? Now, maybe you could have consistency and happen to also have correspondence, but you couldn't verify it. You couldn't know it. You need an opening in the consistency per se, a hole, what I'll call a Gödel point. And that's talked about in Reconstructing A as A. You need a hole to see through, quote unquote, the consistency to tell that there is a correspondence. But the moment you do that, the consistency is broke. And so you have to choose between correspondence and consistency, of which means, since to get a formal system, you need both simultaneously, this creates a problem. It again means incompleteness is unavoidable. Gödel showed that it is impossible to give a meta-mathematical proof of the consistency of a system comprehensive enough to contain the whole of the arithmetic, unless the proof itself employs rules of inference different in certain essential respects from the rules used in deriving theorems within the system. Again, that's from the Nagel book. Well, if you need rules that are qualitatively different from within the system to justify the system, then the system cannot provide those rules. Therefore, a formal system is impossible. And, the famous way that Gödel tries to kind of gets at all this is through talking about the liar's paradox. And the liar's paradox is the following: true or false? This statement is false. If you say true, then it's not false. If you say false, well, then it is true, right? You're stuck. Gödel shows, to put this very simply, he shows that you cannot, in a formal system, assure that there is no liar's paradox. There always could be a liar's paradox. And if that's so, then a formal system is theoretically impossible. That doesn't mean truth is impossible. That doesn't mean a system couldn't be true or correspond. But it could not provide all of that on its own. It could not provide justification of its correspondence on its own. So a way that Nagel and Newman will put this, we have just shown that G is undecidable within principle mathematical. G represents the liar's paradox. So in particular, G has no proof inside principle mathematical. But that, recall, is just what G asserts. So G asserts the truth. Hence, if Principia Mathematica is consistent, it is incomplete. In its completeness, it is that which is incomplete. Principia Mathematica turns out to be not just incomplete, but essentially incomplete, and that's very important. As Gödel put it himself, the statement C is inconsistent is not C provable, and that's from the book on formally undecidable propositions on Principia Mathematica and related systems. That's what Gödel wrote. So basically, G is in a system. You could have G in a system that says this is indeterminable. The system will find it's indeterminable, so that is true. So it is determinable, and that breaks down the whole thing. Like, if you can locate in a formal system that which says this cannot be formalized, and that which cannot be formalized can indeed be formalized, then the system in its formalization entails an acknowledgement of its inability to be formalized. And this creates an issue. Now, does that all kind of sound insane? Does that kind of all sound mad? Well, yeah. Yeah, that's what, like that, again, going back to Alfred Korzybski, there's a certain craziness in this, which, looking far ahead, is going to get us to Thomas Pynchon novels like Gravity's Rainbow or The Crying of Lot 49. But here, the notion is that we can basically say that Korzybski is warning us that if we do not logically and formally take seriously what Gödel is saying, then we're going to practically be seeking various formal systems in our worldview, in our philosophy, in our science, in our daily lives, in our thoughts, and not even know it. And then we're going to eventually arrive at a Gödel point of which will drive us mad, because we will find this point of incompleteness. We will not be able to quilt into the consistency of our system, and this will drive us mad. Now, the paper is also going to talk about Zizek and Lacan. This is the point of the real. The real is the point that says this isn't this. It's the point in reality. It's the point in the symbolic that says this is not the symbolic. And yet, in being part of the symbolic, and you could even say the imaginary, thus it is part of it, and it undermines the whole thing. And that's the real. That's that point that cannot be quilted. And yet that makes possible the symbolic, because the symbolic arises precisely to deal with the real. And this is later going to get us into the map is the territory stuff. And we bring up that phrase because Alfred Korzybski is, if not the inventor of the phrase, the map isn't the territory, is certainly the one who made it popular and spread it. And if the map is not the territory, you could say that in every map is eventually entailed the point that says this isn't part of the map. Well, that is part of the map, and so then the map becomes, it can't be the territory, there has to be something beyond the map, but also it really cannot access what is the territory, and so it's in this point of madness, potentially, that is the real, the Gödel point, and in being the real, if we're not prepared for it, can make us mad, and what, drive us nuts, and Korzybski is absolutely warning us that if we do not better develop our symbolic and our thinking, then when we encounter this point, we're going to be in trouble. We're not going to be prepared. We're going to be Odifia from The Crying of Lot 49 versus children in the Nietzschean sense, and that belonging, again, we'll talk about extensively. The first part of the paper, section 4, will then talk about Rebecca Goldstein's tremendous book on Kurt Gödel, that I really liked. I would highly suggest that. And we will move on in the paper to start talking about Zizek, Leibniz, Austin Farah, and others. For more by OG Rose, please visit ogrose.com, Twitter, Anchor, Instagram, Amazon. Any book purchases are major help. All reviews are major help. And thank you so much for your time.